All right, thank you everyone for coming today. My welcome to UNE's one night teaching on climate and justice. My name is Lydia Pinard and I am a senior oceanography major with minors in climate change studies and applied mathematics. I will be your moderator for this evening's panel on our changing world. Anthropogenic climate change is an issue that will affect ourselves, our children, and countless others across the globe. It is crucial that we understand this issue and we are prepared for our changing world as a result of climate change. Each of our panelists will speak for about 5 minutes. After all panelists' comments, we'll open it up to questions and discussions with the audience. I'm going to take a moment to introduce our panelists for the day. First, we have Dr. Holly Parker, Director of UNE North. We also have Dr. David Livingstone Smith, Professor of Philosophy at UNE. Joining us via Zoom is Dr. Charles Tilburg, Director of School of Marine and Environmental Programs at UNE, and my research advisor. Dr. Jeri Fox, Associate Professor of Aquaculture and Aquarium Sciences at UNE, and one of the founders of the aquaculture movement in the United States. And Professor Greg Labonte, Visiting Assistant Teaching Professor of Biology at UNE. We will begin this evening with Dr. Parker. Dr. Parker, would you like to start us off?
Absolutely. So this is working. Awesome. So if you could advance the slides. My name is Holly Parker. I'm the director of UNE North, which is the Institute for North Atlantic Studies here at UNE. Next slide. So we were founded in 2018, and the Institute really is focused on building teams across sectors and disciplines to address issues of sustainable development here in Maine and throughout the North Atlantic region. We were founded really in response to an economic impetus, which was the arrival of AIM-SCIP, which is the Icelandic shipping company. It made its home in Portland, Maine, and suddenly a lot of heads turned to the north and the east to think about ideas of shared challenges with economies, but also opportunities for meeting challenges that are facing our communities and our environments. So we founded the Institute in 2018. And this map is an image that hangs on our wall at our office. It's a big wall mural at our facility up in Portland. And this really shows a little bit of how we see Maine and relative to the rest of the world. It's a bit of a different point of view. Maine is down there kind of towards the bottom, looking all kind of nice and cute, sticking out there from the top of the northeast of the US. And then all those areas in dark blue are areas where we actively are partnering or are actively seeking partnerships. And I'm going to come back to the partnership question in a few minutes. You can advance the slides. So the key foundational framework for our work at UNE North are the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And so you can see them up on the screen right now. They're very colorful, very attractive and appealing. They were adopted by all the United Nations member states in 2015. This is no small feat. To get all member states of the UN to affirm any particular policy, that's pretty challenging, and it was done in 2015. And they were designed to provide a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity for people in the planet, both now and in the future. And I want to kind of draw your attention to how this is structured. We see that at the top row, we see a lot of the human concerns that were initially the drive of this policy. This policy was began development in the late 20th century, with a focus on, and remember this like for later on, with a focus on addressing issues of human poverty and inequity. That was the original focus of this policy. As it was developed over time, the interconnectivity of our human and environmental systems became a key component of this policy. And you'll see towards the bottom line of goals, you'll see things like climate impact, life below water, life on land, and other biosphere concerns. So just the evolution of this policy over time demonstrates that the UN at a mega policy level was recognizing that interconnectivity of human systems and also recognizing that there was the potential to have healthy and thriving human communities, economies, and environments living alongside each other. All right, so this is really a policy that's driven by hope. Next slide, please. So this is another way of looking at the Sustainable Development Goals. This is called the wedding cake. And this was an image derived by the Stockholm Resiliency Center. And you can see that they have now layered these different pieces of the goals in a much more demonstrable way. So the bottom, the foundational part of the cake is the biosphere and its health. The middle part is human society, and then the top is economy. What you notice is that number 17, my personal favorite goal, and a goal that drives all that we do at UNE North, is partnerships for the goals. So if you imagine this is a really yummy piece of cake, okay? The best part is the jam and the frosting that holds it all together. That's number 17. And so when I'm thinking about the Reverend's presentation, and he was talking about creating more opportunity, breaking down silos, creating partnerships, getting more voices in the room, this is exactly what is intended by partnerships for the goals, as well as number 16, which is just and equitable institutions to pursue this work. So none of this work is done in a bubble. It's done across sectors and across disciplines. There is a place for everyone in the sustainability movement as well as in the climate movement. That is really clear. It's really all of our jobs to do this work. So this is the framework we use at UNE North to plan all of our activities, to assess all of our activities and make sure we're doing a good job. And one last point I'll leave you with, this framework is known around the globe. So I was really fortunate that on behalf of UNE, I was able to attend the climate conference in Glasgow this last year. And this is the language that is spoken at that conference. We have an opportunity at UNE and here in Maine to bring this language a little more to the forefront and how we think about the problems that we want to solve moving forward. So that's me. Woo! I ended that perfectly.
You really did.
That was another, okay.
A different party. Pay no attention.
Pay no attention, so I'm handing off to Dr.
Hi, everyone. I trust you'll tell me when I approach 5 minutes. When I have to speak about something important, I don't rehearse. I try to speak from the heart. That's what I'll do today. I'm a philosopher. I teach philosophy here at UNE. I do philosophy. You might think, well, what does that have to do with this topic? Well, actually quite a lot. And in particular, the sort of work I do. Now, let me warn you that, as any of my students will attest, or anyone familiar with my work, I do not do sweetness and light. I do not put a happy face on catastrophes. I am not optimistic, but I am hopeful, by which I mean, I think we have an obligation to do the best we can under conditions that are unlikely to work out. Now, I've alluded to my work. For the last, say, 17 years of my career, I've devoted myself to studying the very worst things that human beings do to one another. Genocidal violence, atrocity, and the way that these things are fueled by the phenomenon of dehumanization. You ask any philosopher, you say, yeah, David Smith's at my school. Oh, he's the dehumanization. Dehumanization, that is conceiving of others as less than human creatures in the interest of perpetrating violence and injustice upon them, is something we slip into all too easily. And we slip into it all too easily under very particular circumstances. So you might all think, as most people think, say if I were in Germany in 1938, I wouldn't have gone along with the Nazi party. Yeah, easy to say. It would have been very attractive, unless, like me, you're Jewish. Dehumanization and the violence flowing from it doesn't arise spontaneously in the human heart. It arises in response to propagandistic rhetoric. And that propagandistic rhetoric is effective to the degree to which the propagandist is able to get his audience to feel insecure, to feel vulnerable, to feel helpless. And that is all the more effective when there are objective conditions of vulnerability and helplessness. Now, I got the inspiration for this idea from what you might regard as an unlikely source, the work of Sigmund Freud on the psychology of religion. Freud argued that the religious impulse stems from our awareness of helplessness. Under the best of conditions, we're helpless. We're helpless in the face of the forces of nature, and we're helpless in the face of human injustice. Sadly, the climate crisis, or the impending climate catastrophe, let's not mince words, pertains to both of those forms of helplessness. On the one hand, we are confronted with the forces of nature, which will create massive suffering amongst human beings. On the other hand, we are confronted with the injustices that will be perpetrated in consequence of climate change. And in particular, the consequence that those most responsible for climate change, the elites, and everyone sitting in this room is an elite, will not pay the main price. Those who have been victims of racism and colonialism and exploitation will and are paying the main price. We need to get ready for the vulnerability of human beings in the face of these objective conditions of helplessness, to be responsive to authoritarian leaders who will encourage them and us to perpetrate grave injustices on one another. Thank you for listening.
So, David, I'm gonna try to. Can everyone hear me? Okay. I've never given a lecture to a group of people that I can't see at all. So I'm going to base all of my reactions on the 4 people that I can see, the 4 panelists. So what I'm going to talk very quickly about is to give everybody, some sort of parameters on what we're going to discuss here, the physical part of it, and I'm going to tie in a little bit to exactly what Dr. Smith just talked about. And so if you can go to my first slide. I am a climate scientist. I've been doing this for the last 25 years. And scientists, we are very, very, very careful. We don't, we cannot speak as well as the David Smiths of the world. We're very careful in everything that we do. And so I want to read one of the very first documents that came out when we first started looking at climate change. So this was 1990. This is when climate change was just starting. And I want you to see how careful the scientists were. They said here, there is concern that human activities may be inadvertently changing the climate of the globe through the enhanced greenhouse effect by past and continuing emissions of carbon dioxide and other gases, which will cause the temperature of the Earth's surface to increase, popular termed global warming. If this occurs, consequent changes may have a significant impact on society. Not a lot, we're not saying very much there. Now jump 30 years. So go to the next slide. Completely changed. Remember, these are the most careful people on Earth. It is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. Widespread rapid changes in the atmosphere, ocean, cryosphere, and biosphere have occurred. We're in a completely different scientific world than we were 30 years ago. Now, there is no doubt by any credible scientist that we have now changed the world. So if you can go to the next slide, when I'm talking about a very brief history, what I have here is the global surface temperature change relative to 1850 to 1900, because you have to start somewhere, for the last 2,000 years, that's the one on the left, and the last 50 years, and then the next 80 years, a prediction of it. And what I want you to see is that on the left-hand slide, the thing that looks almost vertical, that's the global temperature change, the average global temperature change. And we've raised the temperature relative to 1850 and 1900, 1 degree. Now that nearly vertical black line on the next slide, or not the next slide, on the one to the right, looks almost horizontal compared to what might happen based on the different choices that we make. So the different colorful lines there are what the temperature might be in 2100 based on what we decide. It may increase by 5 degrees. It may increase less than 1.5 degrees. That all depends on what we as humans do. 1.5 degrees doesn't sound like that big of a deal. If you go to the next slide, you see that it is, because all kinds of different places can have much larger temperature changes. And one of the things that Dr. Smith talked about here, so on the left-hand side is what's going to happen if there's an average 2 degrees Celsius global warming. On the right is 4 degrees. And I want you to look at South America and Africa and the Middle East and China and the Far East. And you'll see that the temperature increases there are greater than they are anywhere but in the Arctic and the Antarctic. So when Dr. Smith was talking about how the elites, which is what we are not going to be affected as much, it's not just that we have money to protect us, it's that literally the changes are not as great for Europe and North America as they are for everywhere else. And Lydia, I think I'm out of time, so I'm going to stop there and let it go to Dr. Fox.
Hello, I've got mine scripted, so I'm going to read off my page. Flooding the food desert. Time is running out. At the very least, the alarm bells are ringing, the red flags are popping, the path is narrowing. Food production, food access, food security. Merely buzzwords at first glance, but think a minute. How critical, how life-sustaining, and how taken for granted are those things that those buzzwords represent. Despite, or in addition to, the devastating and heart-wrenching events in Ukraine right now, food, and additionally water, limitation might be the thing that sends the world into chaos. The first things that pop into our heads when we think of the climate crisis are pictures of increased destructive weather patterns, more forest fires, coral reefs bleaching, emaciated polar bears adrift on ice floes. And as emotionally overwhelming as that is for probably everyone in this room, there are those that might say that those are survivable. We can get through to that. I won't die from that. But think of the ripple effect of those disasters. Think of the root cause of the corals bleaching or the skinny polar bears, the forest fires in Western places, and ponder what it is that really means. Some places are too wet or too hot or too dry. The polar bear and the coral are simply very visible and are being put center stage. Their loss is incalculable, but ultimately survivable. Let's take our mind's eyes off those images for a minute and let me redirect them instead to America's heartland, the breadbasket of America. Allow me to give you some sobering facts. For now, as the population grows, our ability to produce food matches the growth until 2050, at which point the curves start to diverge. We are losing 3 acres a minute of arable land. The earth has lost 1/3 of its arable land in the last 40 years. In response to this, the response to this could be that at least we live in America, where the impact will be felt the least. Maybe you're right. Phytoplankton contribute half of the oxygen that we breathe. What's happening to our phytoplankton as the climate changes is highly contested. Let's leave it at the phytoplankton is currently highly divergent. And there are bloom and die cycles that are changing. And we all breathe from the same supply of air. Okay, I got off a little track a little that bit of information. So let's get back to the breadbasket of America. To that soil that allows us to grow all those wonderful things to eat, that allows us to feel complacent about our ability to access food, at least in our lifetime. That soil has been producing and yielding vast amounts of food pretty much since post-World War II. We have been producing so much without a break that we have depleted it of natural supplies of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and organic carbon. And when that ran out, research gave us synthetic forms, but those get used up pretty quickly. We're losing all our nitrogen to the atmosphere, our organic carbon to the landfills, and we've just about mined out all our natural phosphorus. We have been greedy and inefficient with our precious soil. It needs attention and time to heal. It is definitely time to become more efficient with our food production. Efficiency is quickly defined, for my purposes, as optimizing use while minimizing waste. There are more efficient practices dealing with soil and more efficient ways to produce food anywhere. There are solutions to food production and there are ways to produce more locally, but we have to be prepared to accept, at least for a while, that more and more of our food needs to come from smaller and smaller places that can be managed and kept healthy. These methods, perhaps, need more forethought, planning, knowledge, and patience. We need to explore places that have previously been ignored because we have a collective memory of vast fields that are planted in wheat and corn. We need to explore making places serve dual purposes, such as structure that also has trays for pots or landscaping that also yields edibles. And perhaps we need to get used to our view of our beautiful oceans and waterways being interrupted by fish cages and oyster floats. Utilizing our nearshore waters fits into that picture of efficient use. So does opening up our warehouses and urbanized areas to tanks and raceways. Imagine growing fish in tanks and vegetables in a soilless medium in downtown Manhattan. You don't really have to imagine it because it's already being done. But also imagine maximizing our urban areas for food production, dual purposing our waterways to also include food. Did you know that healthy soil is capable of removing a third of the carbon emissions that drive our climate crisis? Did you know that kelp, an aquaculture product that is also healthy food, has the capacity to pull down 1 to 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide a year? Let's make our food production more efficient and give our soil time to heal. It might also help to lessen our fears of food access if we do. The time has come. We have to start thinking like this.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. Tremendous to see the turnout of young minds like the Reverend was speaking about. It's really you that is going to be pushing this movement. So it's really tremendous to see you out here. And thank you to my colleagues for the wonderful information. I learned a lot from all of their talks. Right? So I wanted to downscale it today and really focus on more of a local issue, something a little more bite-sized than a global climate issue. And I wanted to show it is happening here in our backyard, in our neighborhood. It is happening. So I wanted to talk to you today about ice out. Ice out is a beautiful time of year. It's right now. It's literally right now. It's what's happening outside. Ice out is when winter's grass finally releases. The ice begins to recede from our lakes. Spring rains come in and wash away our ice. A lake is rejuvenated. You can go to the next slide. We get these beautiful, picturesque lakes. Our migratory species are returning. Our local fauna is flourishing. This is a great time to be in Maine. And it's consistent. We know that every single year it's going to happen. We're going to transition from winter to spring. If it wasn't a guarantee, we probably would not be here. I know I certainly would not. So here we are in this transitional period. Next slide, please. What's interesting though is, when does this happen? We know that it's going to happen in the springtime, but do we have any data? to back up, when is ice out? When will the ice leave our lakes? When can I go paddleboarding again in my hometown lake, right? You can go to the next slide. We have very, very little, almost none actually, which is amazing. You think it's something that we would want to be focused on. We do have an incredible amount of data on one lake. It is called Conti Lake. It's right next to Augusta. It's about an hour and a half, hour and 15, depending on what kind of driver you are, away from us north here. All right? You can go to the next slide. From 1800 to 1900, ice out on Conti Lake happened before the 100th day of the year. That is April 10th. It happened before that one time. An abnormality, a freak summer, spring, right? Once in 100 year, that's pretty rare. From 1900 to 2000, it happened 17 times. Ice out before April 10th. Starting to get a little more frequent. And from 2001 to 2021, you can actually add 2022, it is now 11 times in 21 years. So in just 200 years, we've gone from something that was freakish, abnormal, insane really to occur, to something that is now happening every other year and probably every single year. So I know what you're thinking. Great. Who cares if I get to go down to Freddie Beach and lay in the sun for an extra, a week earlier or 2 weeks earlier? Who cares if I get to go to Bitterford Pool and, stick my feet in the water and my butt in the sand? Who cares, right? You go to the next slide. This guy right here, they care. They care tremendously. You'll notice that the snowshoe hare on the left is white and the snowshoe hare on the right is brown. Snowshoe hare are one of Maine's keystone species. They inhabit almost every piece of forest in our state. Undoubtedly, across the street, there are snowshoe hare there. These snowshoe hare, they change color in order to protect themselves. In fact, their defense from predators is often to stand completely still. They have no big teeth or sharp claws. They trust their camouflage. Their camouflage changes in the winter from white and into the spring to brown to match their surroundings. But you would think, well, their coat color must change based off temperature. It must change based off the amount of snow that's around them. No, it is changed off the time of day, the amount of daylight that they receive. So as our ice out happens earlier and earlier, so does the amount of snow that we have. How do you think the snowshoe hare is going to fare as a white marshmallow jumping around in a dirt brown riddled forest? Their outlook is pretty grim, I would say. You go to the next slide. This is just one animal, of course, that is being impacted here in Maine. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of these systems that are occurring. Right? I just wanted to show you that one because the snowshoe hare is near and dear to my heart. That's one of my favorites. But I wanted to remind you that when you are asking for climate reform, you are not just asking for climate reform on a global stage like we've heard today. You're not asking for reform just on a continental stage. You are asking for reform for our state, on our campus, and in your neighborhoods. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much for your comments on our changing world. At this time, I'd like to open it up for questions or comments. Feel free to address your questions to the entire panel, to a particular person, or to the entire audience. Yeah.
You need the microphone.
I think I'm good. Everyone can hear me?
You need the microphone
Yes,
for the recording.
Oh.
So please give it.
Okay, so all right, and so we have been told a lot about how bad things are, and it can get kind of overwhelming. Like, okay, so this is like my generation's responsibility to fix. If we don't fix it, no one will. What are some of your favorite solutions to climate change that you've seen?
Well, like I said, I'm not real optimistic. So, yeah, well, that's a good place to start. So anything from that is up, right? I think we have to really properly assess the political forces that would need to be marshaled to deal with this. I'm influenced by a really good book on political philosophy and climate change called Climate Leviathan by Wainwright and Mann. And they project 4 possible scenarios, only one of which is the most ill-defined, is hopeful. So one scenario is capitalist civilization maintains itself by creating climate standards and enforcing them on the world. It's a global problem, so it needs to have a global solution, you see. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem very likely. I mean, it requires the elites, those wealthy nations and those wealthy people, and again, I want to insist, no matter how broke you are as a student, you are a member of that class, to make sacrifices on behalf of those most affected. In the past, that hasn't worked out very well. Look at the French Revolution, look at the Russian Revolution. In fact, capitalist civilization sees climate change largely as an opportunity to make money, in things like catastrophe bonds and so on. Another possibility, which they call climate Mao, is an authoritarian socialist dictatorship. Now that would have much greater power to implement reforms, but it's an extraordinarily repressive solution. A third, which I actually think is most likely, is an anti-solution. They call it climate behemoth. And that is nations retreating into nationalism and climate denial. And effectively, the elite nations becoming gated communities. And that is very important because what climate change is going to give us is unprecedented refugee issues. I mean, already we see this. And unprecedented levels of violent conflict. Already we see this. Violent conflict has tripled in the 10 years between 2010 and 2020. So those are the really crappy things. What they think has the best prospect, but many are skeptical of the possibility of succeeding, is grassroots movements rejecting these hegemonic solutions or this non-solution, right? People organizing, and often people who are most affected. That's going to be largely in the developing world, right? So I'm afraid I couldn't give you anything too cheerful, but I think it's fairly.
I'll try to lighten up the room a little bit, but there's a lot of reality to what you just said, and so 2 things: a quick story, and then a structure that I think has some potential. So I was able, as I said, to go to COP26, and that was tremendous. And I'm happy to report that UNE is the only institution that has observer status for the COP going forward. So we got that last year. We're going to continue with that. So keep an eye on that because we are going to be there as observers moving forward. Yeah, we're going to try. We're going to, believe me, I'm working on it. We probably won't go this coming year, but hopefully in another year we'll go back. I left that experience feeling very conflicted. Okay. I'm a policy nerd, so it was the ultimate policy stage to go observe and see how is it working or not working, and with the urgency behind it that we have to do this now, right? I left with tremendous hope hearing the voices of young people, particularly people from developing nations who were speaking pretty aggressive truth to the UN assembly there. I was also really heartened to see the advocacy outside of the COP. So you had people who were working outside of the structure through protest, through grassroots organizations. We had people inside the COP working again through grassroots and those pieces. So that was really important to see that alive and well. I left with the feeling that the structure itself is antiquated and not up to the task of doing the work it needs to do. So it is one of those behemoths that you're speaking about. So I left very conflicted. I came home thinking, all right, what am I doing? I just went to this amazing global event. I came back to Portland and I thought, oh Lord, am I, this is really hard. This is really hard. And I felt down. I did not feel the inspiration I hoped to feel when I came back from COP. And then I went to do a project that UNE North was doing with some middle school kids in Portland. It's a group of underserved kids. They go to an after-school program there, and we've been doing a semester-long project using art to talk about sustainability and what do they want to see their sustainable Portland looking like in 10 years. And I hadn't seen them in a couple of weeks, and I went back, talked to them. They want to know where I went. And so I showed them a couple of YouTubes of some young people who had spoken at the COP, and one of them was a young woman named Elizabeth Watuti from Kenya. And she opened the conference. Brilliant. I mean, everybody's crying, dead silent. And I showed this to a bunch of 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. And I asked them, just tell me what you saw. What did you hear? Just open it up. And a young woman raises her hand. She goes, I see a Black woman speaking to a room full of old white men. And I said, good observation. And what reaction are they having? And she goes, she's killing it. She's doing an amazing job. Yes. And that was the moment of hope. Not just because they had seen, I got to see Elizabeth's speech, but these young people saw it and understood the power of what she was doing and what she was up against. That to me was really super important. So I would say that the structure that I point to often, although the last month, not so great, the Arctic Council is a really interesting diplomatic body that was founded 25 years ago to address issues in the Arctic, particularly around climate and other interests. It is a group of the 8 Arctic nations, as well as 6 permanent participant groups that represent the indigenous people of the Arctic. And they all have equal voice on the council. Up until a month ago, it was highly functioning. It was doing a great job. Unfortunately, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia has put a pause to all engagement in the Arctic Council, which is sad for us to see. But for 25 years, it was managing to get across all political boundaries and also be absolutely inclusive and have the voice of the people of the place at the table. And so that was a model I think did help.
I'm going to answer your question a little bit more simply than that. I figure I'm the only person that I have complete control over. So what I do on a daily basis is I don't waste. It's the thing that I can do that I can contribute because I don't sit at the big tables. So I take what I need, I use what I need, I don't go beyond that. So that's how I approach each day, doing what I can.
I have really nothing to add to the discussion there. I think, I too don't have a big seat. There are, I guess, as far as a solution, I'll give you exact solutions, and transitions in diets has been something that I really like. And I've been trying to do that as well. As you get older, you can't have 6 chocolate bars on the weekend, anymore, and be fine, So you have to change your diet around. But when I was a kid, like when I was 8, I would have red meat, potatoes, glass of milk every single day for, I don't know, my whole childhood. That was just normal. I had cereal in the morning, sugary cereal with a large bowl of milk and then a large glass of milk, and like that was not uncommon when I was a kid, and I'm sure some of you experienced something similar. Right. So changes in diets, we now know the impact that certain farming industries can have on our climate, and it really is dictated by the consumer. That's really what Dr. Fox is talking about. You can make a personal change, and if just you do it, no, it probably won't happen. But it will take an effort, a united effort. But if you're not united, then how could it be a united effort, right? So, yeah, I think that changing your diets up to be more climate conscious of certain farming practices is a good solution that everyone can get behind, not only because it's beneficial for the climate, but it could also be beneficial for your health. So I like that as a solution. Hope that answers.
Dr. Tilburg, you had something that you wanted to say?
Yeah, so what I want to add is that I don't want any of us to kid ourselves into thinking that our individual actions are going to make any change, any appreciable effect on climate change. And that we need to band together to make any changes. And so you asked, what's my favorite way to stop climate change? Well, I don't think we're going to stop climate change, but one of my favorite things that has happened is, to me, it's the explosion of electric vehicles, and that, very rich companies have seen that there is now a market for something that is actually good for the environment, because there's been enough people that are interested in it and doing it. And so I think that's the way that we can actually make change, is with these conglomerates and these governments seeing that it's actually helpful to them and their bottom line because of particular choices that large swaths of people make. And so what my favorite thing is talking to students like you, is trying to get as many people to think about this and make changes. And an example I like to do is, I drive a Honda CR-V and it gets 30 miles to the gallon. I could change that and buy a Tesla. Well, I can't, because I can't afford a Tesla. If I made a little bit more money, I could buy a Tesla. I could do as much good for the environment if I convince 10 people to not drive gas guzzling cars. The more people that you get to make good decisions, like Greg just talked about, the more effect you can have. You can't do it, but all of us together can actually make changes. And one of the things, that Reverend Yearwood said is, we have 8 years. The IPCC talks about 11 years, and that the amount of carbon emissions that we're making right now, we have 11 years until we hit 1.5 degrees. And as Dr. Smith said, everything goes from bad to catastrophic. We do have time. It's not just for the 20-year-olds, it's the 50 and 60-year-olds, because we only have 10 years to fix this. We're all in this together. And if we all make small changes, we can actually reach these goals. One person doesn't have to be take the ultimate sacrifice.
To add to what Dr. Tilburg is saying, making the opportunities to engage in moving forward with sustainability accessible and equitable for all people. So as here, we're talking about EVs and whether we can afford them. We are the elite. So we need to make these technologies accessible. We also need to make the benefits of those technologies, be it to economies and communities, equitable, so that it doesn't become exacerbating the inequalities that we already have in our economies with developing and developed nations, if we're going to use that term. We need to bring everyone along in this moment and not perpetuate inequities that are already there as we try to move towards solutions.
Great thoughts from everyone. We have time for 1 or 2 more questions.
So kind of on the same topic with what Dr. Tilburg was just speaking of, but I wanted to ask all of you, if you were in our position about 20 years younger, what would you do to enact change upon climate change in the future, and how would you be the change in order to get everybody to work together?
That's a great question.
Testing. Is this working?
It's a great question. I didn't catch your name. What was your name? Taylor, that's an excellent question. I will say, can I be a 20-year-old today? Can I do that instead?
Yeah.
Back when I was 20 years old, I guess that long ago, but I'd rather be 20 years old today. It's much better than back then. So the number one thing that I would do is I would get on social media and I would start my own company. And it doesn't need to be a company that makes money. That is not really essential. But what is essential is that your voice gets heard. And so if you're someone who cares about climate change, it's so easy to have 10 to 100,000 real people following your voice. Now, when I was 20, social media was around, but it wasn't like it is today. I couldn't blow up on TikTok and have 5 million views in a day. I couldn't do that. You have that option now. So if I were to go back, I would create my own company, right? And it wouldn't be about making money because, or maybe it does turn into that, I don't know. But my primary pillar of my new company would be to promote, positive climate change or things that I think that the masses of my age group should be doing. Because we're all influenced on a day. How many of you are influenced by a TikTok or an Instagram post or a Facebook post on a daily basis? Every single person in this room. So it's super easy for any one of you to get together with 4 friends and say, hey, let's start something. That has power. If you can influence, like Dr. Tilburg was saying, if you can influence 100 people, that does way more work than any individual effort you could ever do. So my number one thing is I would go and I would start a company, social media movement, a page, a TikTok page, whatever. I would start that and I would work at it every day. Slow growth, but good growth. Get the message out. That's what I would do.
So I'm also a recovering high school English teacher, so I'm going to talk on that for now. Develop your listening and storytelling skills. Because this work, to influence someone, you need to be able to have empathy for them, understand where they're coming from in order to change their mind. If we operate only in echo chambers, we will not grow a movement. We will get to a certain point and it won't be able to expand anymore. So being able to tell your story and then sit and listen to someone else's story, understand their anxiety in the face of climate change, understand their fear in the face of climate change, why they might want to hold it at an arm's length and say, don't want to go there. You need to be able to do those skills. It's hard work, but take a moment as you're diving into data and figuring out all, the science side of things. Think about the humanities, think about how we relate to each other and listen to it.
I did. I would say run for office. You're 20 years old. You may not win, but you're going to start. And eventually you are going to be a politician. And that's where you can make the largest changes. Right now, the United States has the ability to completely change the trajectory on which our emissions are going. Our politicians are not willing to do it. However, if I had started 20 years ago and I was a very influential senator, I would be able to help make that change. The changes have to be systemic. They have to be in the infrastructure that we have. And so I would ask all of you 20-year-olds, run for office so that you can be making those decisions.
So this question is more so for Jeri, but I'd also love to hear if you guys also have anything else to say. But talking about onshore and offshore aquaculture, how would you market that to the general public as a more sustainable alternative than traditional agriculture?
What kind of aquaculture did you say?
Like both onshore and offshore?
So my part of that is the food production. So I think as close as we can keep our production to any, our area, like in our own backyard, local labor. So utilizing near shore, onshore locations for food production is being more efficient. And it's being in charge of and knowing where your food comes from and making it accessible to everybody. So making it accessible, growing it locally, and cutting down on this dependence on other places that are unseen and unknown, and putting stress on environments that we don't have to live in, I think is something that we have to be aware of, that we need to be in control more of our own future and keeping things close at hand, being efficient with food production, and yeah, just knowing where this all does, what we have at risk, and how fragile it really is, makes us more aware and it makes us more engaged in food production.
All right, with that, we will have to, we've come to the end of the hour, so please join me in thanking our panelists and everyone